where I started to go before we took the break, I'm looking for observations about design-based specifications. So who has an observation they want to share? I know we got a lot of laughs. It was fun, but we're trying to do this for a purpose. So, yes?
There was a lot of assumptions going on.
A lot of assumptions.
Specifications.
And why did you have to make assumptions?
Because they weren't that detailed.
Even though some of them were very detailed, they still weren't detailed enough to be able to follow it to the nth degree. I see some shaking of heads. And you agree with that? You want to amplify?
It's like when it was about the top of the knife and how we interpret the top of the knife and how the group who wrote it, how they meant it. So how they meant it and how we interpret it was very, very different because it resulted in a smaller production of what it was we were to put on the grid.
Okay, you had issues, again, the interpretation part, that they said top of the knife, and you had to make an interpretation what top of the knife even meant. And one way would have resulted in more application than the other way. So interpretation and detail. Anybody else?
When you put it together, the specifications, you should map out, your steps, what you want to accomplish.
Have to do, before you write them, map them out so you make sure you can get every detail.
Right.
Yes?
I think most of us know how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and I don't think we took into consideration that when we put that spec out there, that it may be going to someone who's never ever done that before. But because it's commonplace for us, we just put in basic things and not thought about the specifics that would have allowed somebody who's brand new to do it right.
You know what you meant, and you just assumed that if you wrote what to you would be adequate specifications, then anybody else would follow that and give you what you thought you wanted. Are specifications hard work?
Yes.
And when you do design specifications, as you experienced, you're writing something that you're trying to think, and lots of times we go from 1 to 3. And we don't say 2 because it is so inherent in what we do that we just assume everyone's going to do the same thing. And you have 2 circumstances that come into play. Number one, if someone isn't familiar with it and doesn't know what 2 is if you don't tell them. Or the other circumstance is if the vendor, and some of you, if I can say this, took delight in trying to be ultra literal. That you, even though you figured you probably knew what they wanted, you were just going to follow them to the T and nothing more. And you have vendors that are going to take that position. They're going to price it to do, if you will, the minimum. And when you don't get what you want, they will come back and say, here's your specifications. Tell me what I'm not following in those specifications. And then you can get in the situation of arguing over minutia, which obviously is not what we're trying to be about. So, all right, is there anything that you can do now, using this as experience of how it's difficult? First thing is, if after having gone through this, we were able to turn around immediately and do it again, would you, each of you, write something differently than you did the first time?
Sure.
So based upon this experience, the experience of going through it one time, you would improve your specifications the second time.
Yeah. And it wouldn't take 20 minutes, it'd take about 4 hours.
Okay, so the 20 minutes would be 4 hours, all right? So it would get longer rather than shorter.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I realize that writing this, even though we only had 1 page, if I were writing it, it would probably been about 5 pages.
5-page specification. All right.
I limited it that.
Okay. Second thing, is there, assuming this is an actual procurement, if you were going out and procuring a vendor to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, would there have been a mechanism that you can think of where even if you would have had inadequate specifications to begin with, that you could have perhaps changed it or cured it before it got to the point of delivery?
Well, at the pre-bid meeting is an excellent opportunity. I'd add a sample there. You know.
Pre-bid conferences, pre-proposal conferences, this is where basically it's the acid test of whether vendors understand your specifications. That and written questions and answers. And what you hope will happen, and I emphasize hope because many times it doesn't, is that when a vendor experiences or identifies what they perceive to be an inadequacy, they will bring it to your attention. That's what we want them to do. We want them to come to us and ask questions or point out things that seem to be confusing so we can cure it before we have the bids or proposals in. So when we go to make an award, we have a much better set of specifications that is more understandable and hopefully won't get in the situation of you fighting with your vendor instead of your vendor actually doing what you want. Any other observations on design specifications? All right, now let me ask, I'll start out, each of you were supposed to do performance-based specifications. So who wants to start off with just reading their performance-based specifications? All right, volunteer. And say loud enough that they can hear you.
Sandwiches must be made in 5 minutes. If made in 2.5 minutes, they receive a 50 cents more per sandwich incentive. Triangle slices must be equally cut. Products made in Maryland, the vendor will receive a 25 cents incentive per sandwich. Recycled bread crust for birds, they will receive a 20 cents incentive per sandwich. And we would want individually wrapped sandwiches with a warning label for peanut products.
Okay.
And they will receive an incentive for that as well.
All right, I'm not going to give any comment. I'm just going to go. Can you read your specifications? I couldn't hear you. Can they do what? Stand next to me, or me next to them. All right, who wants to do it on this one? And let me get back and stand next to her.
Okay. Assemble an edible, delicious, and fresh peanut butter and jelly sandwich using the ingredients and supplies below. And then we listed the peanut butter, Skippy Creamy, 16.3 ounces, jelly, Concord grape, 20-ounce container, knife, plastic knife, plate, paper plate, 6 ounce, bread, 2 white sliced Wonder bread, not heels, spoon, plastic. Number 2, present the peanut butter and jelly sandwich on the paper plate cover to ensure freshness. And number 3, present the fresh peanut butter and jelly sandwich on October 12, 2010 at the following time and place, 10 a.m., 201 West Preston Street, Baltimore, conference room L3.
Okay, I won't comment. I will just move. Oh, the third table is, were you part of the third table? Or you were part of this group? All right, I'll go back here. Your performance-based, who has?
I'm not sure if we made it.
We never got that.
Never got to it. All right, performance-based specifications.
We said the contract.
Read it loudly, please.
Okay, the contractor shall create a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that meets U.S. dietary and nutritional requirements. PBJ sandwich must be aesthetically pleasing and can be consumed in a manner that minimizes content on hand.
And that's all you said?
That's all we said.
Okay, how about up here?
They said the vendor should have bread, peanut butter, and jelly, and the vendor should be able to provide one fully assembled, ready to safely consume peanut butter and jelly sandwich, must be assembled in less than 5 minutes, should be placed on paper plates provided.
Okay. And
Ours was close to what they had, but we didn't write it down.
they like what you said. Ditto. Up here. Is this one group or two? You were part of them. You were part of them. So everyone has done theirs. All right, let's get some characteristics now of performance-based specifications. I picked up on, I think, about 5 words that I was expecting to hear. You had 3 of them.
Assemble.
No. Let me read this. Edible, delicious, fresh. Edible, delicious, fresh. Are they qualitative statements? I heard one, nutritious.
Yes.
Okay, and I might have heard another one that I was kind of expecting to hear. Yes and no. Delicious is subjective. Yeah. Performance-based specifications require subjective evaluation.
Yes.
That is the whole emphasis on performance-based specifications. That instead of giving to the nth degree what is to be done, it specifies the end result. And that end result is generally shorter, but requires a subjective evaluation to determine whether it is that way. Delicious. Now, we could go around perhaps to every one of us and have them taste something, and maybe a lot of you would think it was really delicious, some of you would think it was okay, and some of you might hate it. But if you are the end customer, for instance, if you have a food vendor that's selling something and guarantees that you'll be satisfied with their product, do they ask you to come up with an objective standard for whether you're satisfied with their product? If you're satisfied, fine. If you're not, you go to them, you say, I don't like it, supposedly they give you your money back. Because you have made your own judgment based upon whatever your criteria is, your taste, of whether it met your standards for what you wanted. So contrasting the two, hopefully what we can see is design specifications usually require a lot more work, usually have a lot more leeway for the gaps and things not happening correctly. And as many of you acknowledged, even though you didn't really expect what you saw, when the vendor came back to you, and the other person was your vendor performing under your specifications, and when you said, you didn't perform as I said, and they said, wait a minute, here's the specs, what didn't I follow that you said? Most of you said, well, I guess you did. And so even though you didn't get what you expected, design specifications, you were obligated to pay them whatever it was that you had agreed that they would be paid for doing the job. Even though you didn't like it, even though you might end up throwing it away. Because that's the nature of design-based specifications. The risk is on the state that you will get what you want versus what you told them you wanted. Performance-based specifications are very risky from the vendor, to the vendor. Give me a fresh, delicious, wholesome, nutritious sandwich that is visually appealing with a wonderful aroma, things of this nature. Okay, you're a vendor. So are you going to take the assignment to produce that? If you're confident that you can do that, that the person's going to like it, then you'll take that, and that will give you the leeway to do something that you think they'll like. That you can take the liberties of, even without specifying, put the two pieces of bread together with the peanut butter and jelly together instead of one up and one down and things like that. So the risk is on the vendor that they have to produce a nutritious, delicious, wholesome, visually appealing, smell, a pleasing aroma, etc. And you decide whether what they present you is those things. And if they do, they get paid, and if you don't, they don't get paid.
Yeah, I never looked at it from that point of view, that the design puts the risk on the state and performance puts the risk on the vendor.
And that's what we've been trying to say.
I never really appreciated that.
Design, and what we said on the slides, with design, the risk is on the state. The risk is on the vendor to follow the specifications precisely.
Right.
But if they follow the specification, then they get paid what they ask for to follow their specifications. The example of going to Chicago, if we said buy airline tickets, and the contractor bought airline tickets and presented them to the state, their responsibility was not to get anybody to Chicago. It was to buy airline tickets, they get paid. Might be nobody gets to Chicago, but the vendor gets paid. Performance-based, if it was get people to Chicago, they only get paid if they get people to Chicago. Performance versus design. And the one way, in this example, the Chicago thing was perhaps a little more abstract than putting it into a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. That's one of the reasons we did this. It's a lot easier to take a very concrete situation and make the comparisons for that same situation that all of you are experiencing. Does that seemingly describe it? Do you have a better understanding of the two type of aspects? And again, from the state standpoint, the recommendation is as much as possible make specifications, make contracts performance-based. But since that puts the risk on the vendors are not as happy with, generally, with something that is performance-based because that means they have to deliver. And sometimes they're confident they can, and if they're not confident they can, they're not going to respond. They're not going to either give you a quote at all, or they're going to quote you a very high price just in case you're not happy. So those have to be taken into consideration. And the key is you make your best guess of what you should do, the best way to specify things, and usually you will have a combination of both of these type of aspects, even in the same specifications and contract. And then what should be encouraged and what you should hope happens is the vendors will open their mouth, that they will let you know if there is confusion so that you can correct it. You can try to address what they perceive as inadequate specifications. And we would much rather have that identified and corrected before we get responses than what I've said over and over. Getting into the award, then the vendor does the work, and the vendor presents it to the state, and you say, that isn't what I want, and they say, but that's what you said, and then you say, no, that isn't what I said. Yes, it is what you said. You got a claim. And you're spending a lot of time fighting a claim, maybe losing the claim, maybe paying more money, because ultimately it comes back to inadequate specifications. Specifications are hard work. So, let's move on. Writing specifications, what a coincidence. All right, these are kind of where we're going. We don't have to say where we're going, we just wait till we get there. Starting with number one, ambiguity equals risk. Ambiguity means lack of clarity. It means, I don't know. It might be this, it might be that. There are two or more reasonable interpretations of a given set of words. Ambiguity creates confusion. It creates the potential for having to award to a vendor you didn't want, or performance problems later, including contract claims. It's bad. You shouldn't do it. Easy to say, not necessarily as easy to implement. All right, case studies of the Maryland State Board of Contract Appeals decision involving risk, which we actually didn't even bring. We have about 4 of them, but we knew we wouldn't have time to go through them, so we're just going to keep talking about these issues of ambiguity. There are 2 types of ambiguity: latent ambiguity and patent ambiguity. One's in blue and one's in yellow. See, that's how easy it is to tell them apart. And remember, wherever you see it, one's going to be in blue, one's going to be in yellow. Latent equals hidden. It isn't obvious before the bids proposals are due that there is an ambiguity. Usually it is something after the contract is being performed that the state and the contractor discover they have differing interpretation for a given contract provision. Questions, and this is important, questions of latent ambiguity are decided against the drafter if there is something that is ultimately determined to be a hidden ambiguity. The person on the hook that's going to lose is the person that wrote the specifications. And guess who wrote the specifications? You did. Specifications are primarily drafted by the state, even if there is a statement in the solicitation that neither party is the primary drafter. which I understand is no longer in the DHMA specifications. Is no longer in DHMA specifications. You told me that once before.
I didn't hear the first part. I see that.
If there is a statement that neither party is the primary drafter.
We don't have that.
Yeah, because when I was here, it always was in there, and I always used to say to the attorneys, how can we not be the primary drafter? We've just spent 6 months writing this thing. The vendor didn't write it. That's okay, we're putting it in there. It means nothing, because we're the primary drafter. A vendor, and here's a question. Oh, here's the guidelines. A vendor does not have to prove that its interpretation of the contract provision at issue is the most reasonable interpretation. All it has to prove is that its interpretation is a reasonable interpretation. Once it is determined that the vendor's interpretation is reasonable, that interpretation prevails. And what we're talking about is if this goes to the Board of Contract Appeals. So first of all, you say to the vendor, you're not performing. The vendor says, I am performing. And you say, and they say, show me what I'm not doing, and you can pull out your specifications, and you say, here, this requires you to do what I'm talking about. And they say, no, that doesn't require me to do that. That certainly is not what I interpreted that to require. I didn't price to do that. Here's what I interpreted that to mean. And so you, the state, say, I don't care, this is what I meant, this is what you have to do. And the vendor says, I don't want to, so you withhold money, and they file a claim. And you deny the claim, and they appeal to the Board of Contract Appeals. So the Board of Contract Appeals will make a determination as to whether they look at both vendors, both parties' interpretation. What you say you meant, what the vendor says they meant, and the actual words. And if the Board of Contract Appeals interprets that there were multiple interpretations of what those same words meant, and it was not obviously apparent that those words were confusing, and the vendor's interpretation that they say they had was reasonable, the Board of Contract Appeals will say, I find for the appellant. I find that they are justified with their interpretation, and so you either live with what they're giving you, or you have to pay more money for what you thought you were going to get to begin with, if there is a latent ambiguity. Vendors can't read our minds and know what we wanted because we didn't say it right. We can't get what we want. The lack of proper planning, proper writing specifications can come back to haunt us later for about the 20th time. Pay me now, pay me later. The opposite of latent ambiguity is patent ambiguity. Patent equals obvious. It is obvious to virtually anyone who reads a given solicitation provision that it simply doesn't make sense, or as soon as I read it, it's obvious that it can have more than one interpretation. And I don't know which interpretation the state means. For an obvious ambiguity, the duty is on the vendor to request clarification of the ambiguity before the bid proposal due date. Duty. They have to ask you questions to find out what you meant for a patent ambiguity. They can't just say, I didn't know what you meant, so I just made an interpretation, I just made an assumption, and gee, was I shocked to find out that my assumption wasn't right. That isn't going to hold water. The vendor cannot just stay silent about the unclear wording and decide the wording means whatever it thinks it means, which generally is whatever the interpretation, whatever interpretation is most advantageous to the vendor, and assume that is what the state means. For an obvious ambiguity, the state's interpretation will prevail. So what that standard is, that if you can tell there's something wrong, it's your duty as a vendor to ask for a clarification. So we have these two different standards. If it's obvious, you're going to win. If it's not obvious, the vendor's going to win. The only question is there an ambiguity, number one? And if there is an ambiguity, is it obvious or not obvious? Those are the things we fight over. Generally, ambiguity isn't in the best interest of either state or vendors. Not rocket science. A contract could be seriously harmed by having to provide something it didn't include in its pricing. The state can be harmed by not getting something that it thought it was getting, and perhaps unless it does a contract modification and it pays more. That may be the only way to get it. Other vendors may have interpreted the provision the way the state intended. Hence, their prices included doing what the state intended. Hence, what seemed to be a higher price might have actually been for what we wanted versus the low price not being for what we wanted that we find out too late. So we might have awarded to the wrong vendor simply because of ambiguity. Let's see. Bless you, yes.
So contract modification would be in order if you had to make a change.
If you discover after the contract is awarded that there's this ambiguity, then what you have to decide is it a patent ambiguity? If it's a patent ambiguity, well, if you think this is obvious, once the vendor points it out, you say there's no way you could have interpreted that. Then you will stick to your guns and you'll say, no, this is what we intended, you perform, and even if they file a claim, if it really is a patent ambiguity, state should win, and they should have to perform for the price they quoted. If you interpret after the vendor comes to you and says, wait a minute, my wildest dream thought you meant that, and after they point that out, you agree with them, or even if you fight them and the Board of Contract Appeals is the one that agrees with them, then you either have to live with what they say their interpretation was, or if they say, pay me more to do what you want, then you have to do a modification. And once the state begins, the state and the contractor should work in unison to achieve the contract objectives. We shouldn't be fighting with each other over money issues, and that's what it all comes down to, money. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to write specifications with no ambiguity. Anything you can probably be challenged in some way as being ambiguous. Just like there were no airtight contracts, there were no totally unambiguous specifications, as you saw from writing a peanut butter and jelly sandwich specification. The objective is to minimize the ambiguity, eliminate obviously ambiguous word statement, etc. And here's some examples. Eliminate absolutes as needed, and we're going to hopefully today yet go to things like as needed. But saying, and this is taking it to extremes, but saying as needed means, oh, I'm going to need it every 5 minutes, when the vendor can interpret as needed as once a week. They have no idea, and you have no idea what the other party, each party is interpreting as needed, if that's all that's said. So that's an obvious ambiguity. Well, can you give me some idea of how often you're going to need it? And either you can quantify it or you can explain a circumstance. We will need it whenever this condition occurs. And then at least they have some more clarification. Maybe you can't say categorically, but to the degree that you can give further clarification, you're better off. Such a literal interpretation doesn't make sense. Specifications should have an element of reasonableness. Duh. A specification with an element of reasonableness can always have a trier of fact, and that is supposedly legal terminology. And for us, the Board of Contract Appeals is the initial trier of fact. And it can be appealed from the Board of Contract Appeals to Circuit Court, and from Circuit Court to the Court of Special Appeals, and from Court of Special Appeals to the Court of Appeals. And each of them will be the trier of the facts in the given situation. You come into, and what they're doing is applying the prudent person concept. For these words, what would a reasonably intelligent, reasonable person interpret the words to mean? And they're going to tell you what the interpretation is, even if that's something different than what you said you did. Usually, a majority of prudent people can agree on what something is. Beauty is the beholder, etc., etc. Extreme interpretations will usually be rejected by the Board of Contract Appeals or the courts. Illegal, punitive actions are not enforceable. Anyone ever heard about the Merchant of Venice? Where, let me see, Shylock and the other guy. Petruchio? I don't know. Some guy agreed to borrow money from, the only one I remember is Shylock, and that Shylock didn't like the guy, and so The terms of repayment was he's going to repay such and such money by such and such date, and if he didn't, Shylock gets a pound of flesh. And lo and behold, there's a shipwreck. There's a storm, and the ship gets wrecked, and so whoever the guy is can't repay the money. And so now Shylock wants to collect his pound of flesh. And he wants to, the date comes when he's supposed to do it, and the fair maiden, Portia or something like that. Caesar's wife, I don't know. But anyway, the woman who loves this one guy who's going to have the pound of flesh taken, supposedly dresses as a man and acts as a lawyer and says that under the laws of Venice that a non-citizen or something like that cannot injure a citizen, and so the taking of the flesh will involve injury or something like that. So even though there was a contract for Shylock to take a pound of flesh, when it came right down to it, that it was illegal, but beyond that, Shylock could be imprisoned or worse for inflicting injury on a citizen of Venice, because if you take a pound of flesh, you have this little inconvenient thing called blood that comes out, and usually comes out to perfusion. And the blood, especially back in, I don't know, the 1700s, 1600s, whenever this was, the guy's going to bleed to death. So even though there was a contract that said that Shylock could take the pound of flesh, when it got right down to it, he couldn't enforce it, and if he tried to enforce it, he risked the possibility of being jailed, or worse, because he caused the death of another person. So that's what pound of flesh means. I know you were dying to hear that.
Amen.
But the trier of fact will try to interpret what was meant by a reading of the total document, not just an isolated statement. So what they do is they don't look at something in isolation. They don't just say, here's the 4 words or the 5 words. They look at the whole document to see if it's consistent, or if the meaning can be interpreted from elsewhere in the document, and they will apply what they think is the correct reading of the entire document. But somebody else may ultimately interpret what you meant in your specifications. And it's best not to leave such issues up to the judgment of another party. Take your best shot at minimizing ambiguity. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of ambiguity. First one, and these are ones I can talk to from experience because I was the offending party. About 1999, we were doing a procurement for health maintenance organization procurement. I was the procurement officer. We were going to make 5 awards. It was mandatory for offers to have some type of national certification. The intent, having discussed this with the Employee Benefits Division when we wrote this, was they said there's, and I don't remember, it was either 2 or 3 types of national certification that they had in mind when they had this requirement for national certification. These were the only types of national certification that employee benefits were aware of and what they meant. And so the assumption, and it's always bad when you're doing assuming, was that vendors would realize what we meant when we said national certification. None of the acceptable certifications were mentioned in the specifications. We didn't say it was going to be NCQA, National Committee for Quality Assurance, or whatever the other ones were, just that a national certification was needed. Nobody asked questions about this requirement. There were many questions, but not one on this aspect. No clarification, no challenge to it. And one of the vendors who responded was the George Washington University Health Plan. They were also an incumbent vendor at that time. So they responded. For its national certification, because they had to identify that they met the minimum requirements, they said, we have a contract with the federal government. And so we said, well, wait a minute. First of all, when we did the specifications, the 5 existing vendors all had one of those national certifications that were intended to be that a vendor should have. And it was known that the George Washington University Health Plan also had one of those national accreditations, at least at the time they had the previous award. And so there was no question in the minds of any of us that we had put the specifications out. There were no questions on the specifications, and the vendors we expected to respond satisfied the specifications, so we thought everything was fine. Until we get the George Washington proposal, and they said, we got the feds and nothing else. So I went back to George Washington and identified this as a deficiency and said, okay, come on, give us the real certification that you have. And they said, we got the federal government. And it's like, okay, where's your NCQA certification? And their answer was that we know you had. We know you had this 5 years ago. And what they said was, this came up for the time of recertification. It would have cost them $20,000 to go through the recertification process. They decided it wasn't worth it, so they simply let their certification lapse. And so my response was, tell me how you equate a contract with the federal government to having a national certification of the type that we had in our minds. And they said, federal government is national in scope. Okay. And they do a very exhaustive analysis of vendors, and they don't just let anybody have a contract to serve federal employees and dependents. And so it is an exhaustive, in effect, certification by a nationwide organization to let them provide health maintenance care. And we listened to that and said, you got to be kidding. Not exactly in those words, but that's what it came down to. The answer, that isn't what we had in mind. You do not meet minimum qualifications. I'm sorry, you're eliminated. And the second bullet, they filed a protest. And in the protest, denial of the procurement.
Was that actually a protest, or was that a claim?
Now, that was a protest, because we were at the point of awarding a new contract.
That's right.
So they filed a protest to me. And I denied the protest, because I said, if George Washington was unsure if it met the national certification requirement, it was its duty to seek clarification. There's no ambiguity here, and if there is an ambiguity, well, no ambiguity. So you had to ask for clarification. You didn't. And at the very least, if you wanted us to change the requirement, you should have told us ahead of time you wanted the requirement changed. Protest denied. George Washington said that it didn't do either of these, either ask a question or ask for the requirement to be changed, because it had absolutely no doubt it satisfied the requirement. Because I remember pointing out in my letter, you had 5 people in the audience. You asked something like 20 questions on this procurement, because I stated all this. Not one of them pertained to this requirement. How can you say that you didn't understand what we meant? And their answer was, we thought we met it. The reason why we didn't ask a question is we didn't have any doubt that we met that requirement. And so we were at the point of, all right, what do we do? Do we hold to our guns, or do we not hold to our guns? So until George Washington's proposal was rejected, it said no idea the state would not accept having a federal contract as meeting the requirements. From its standpoint, George Washington thus felt there was a latent ambiguity in the minimum qualifications, that they said they had no idea that we intended it differently than they interpreted it. And so it gets down to, was there an ambiguity? Was it a latent ambiguity? Was it a patent ambiguity? i.e., it could not reasonably have been known how the state meant this requirement before being rejected, that George Washington could not reasonably have known how the state meant this requirement before being rejected for not meeting it. Initially, DBM, meaning me, and also employee benefits, thought that this wasn't an ambiguity at all. And if it was a patent ambiguity. It was obvious. And if it was patent, that meant George Washington should have inquired, could have asked us, we could have answered, etc. But now we come to the other, what is it Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story. Okay. But DBM also knew that if it denied the protest and the denial was appealed, that the decision of the Board of Contract Appeals could center on whether it was reasonable for George Washington to have concluded it met the requirement. I.e., the decision wouldn't focus on what DBM said it meant by the requirement. It would focus on whether it made any sense for George Washington to conclude it meant the requirement. And what we ended up doing was upholding the protest. Because of that and because of some other circumstances. Because, number one, it avoided a possible protracted protest and appeal process. Even though what George Washington had wasn't what we intended, and it was felt that we ultimately could have won. We felt if we went all the way on the mat and fought this through the Board of Contract Appeals, we could have probably prevailed. However, in this instance, we decided it was better not to even fight the battle because it was in everybody's best interest to let them win. In reality, this was a battle we would rather have preferred to lose. And the reason is because George Washington, number one, was an incumbent. Number two, I think was among the 5 incumbents was the highest rated on satisfaction surveys and other qualitative ratings. So they were extremely good vendor. We didn't even have 5 responses. So we could make 5 awards. I think with them we had 4 responses. So we could make an award to everyone who responded. And it was highly unlikely that any of the other offers would protest George Washington receiving an award. So they're an incumbent, they do a good job. We can make an award without theoretically harming any other vendor, and so all we had to do was agree with their interpretation. It was a latent ambiguity, and we can award the contract and be done with it. So that's what we did.
How would you address the question of the other vendors who did federal work without national NCQA certifications, who did not bid on this because of their misinterpretation?
Question is, all right, let me see if I can restate that. You can look at it. The question was, what about other vendors that might have also had contracts with the federal government that theoretically could have responded and didn't because they looked at the requirement, figured they didn't meet the requirement, and so didn't bother to respond? And the answer is, yeah. If anyone else even thought about responding, they should have asked. If they would have responded and we came up with a different interpretation for them, they'd had an issue to protest. There could have been a lot of conjecture, but what it comes down to is we're not going to do a speculation of what might have happened from somebody who didn't actually respond. If they responded, that's one thing. If they didn't respond, they're out of the picture. They have no standing to protest. They have no standing.
Do you think you would have actually won if you'd have taken it? I think you would have lost.
Well, that was the issue.
But if GW was the incumbent,
One of 5.
okay, and that requirement was in the previous contract, and they let that lapse, there's a problem there, though.
And that's what you're saying is they're an incumbent. Was that requirement in the prior contract? Probably. I don't really know. I wasn't at DBM for the prior contract, and I don't remember whether that was a new requirement or whether that was a carryover requirement. I kind of think it was new, but I can't say for sure.
But
if it was a carryover, again, maybe the issue didn't come up the previous time. Maybe they had NCQA, and even if they let it lapse, they still thought either way they had it covered, either with the federal contract or the NCQA.
That's why I would have thought you would have lost.
So maybe we would have. And what it comes down to is we admitted, at least after they pointed out, we should have done something different. We should have done a better job of saying what we meant.
What certification?
And so, particularly in this situation where it was like, we win by losing. We win by letting them prevail on their statement this was a patent ambiguity, because we get a good vendor that we can award to, and the people that have them as an HMO are happy, and I think they had a reasonable price. So we were actually happy to let them win in this case. But it all originated with the unclear national certification requirement. If we only meant that 2 or 3 specific certifications were acceptable, we should have said that. By not doing so, we introduced the possibility of ambiguity and the differing interpretation by authors. It was kind of our fault. Not kind of. Second one, WIC. The first one was when I was at DBM, the second one was when I was here. WIC RFP for food stores to accept food vouchers had contradictory specifications. And this doesn't happen anymore because after this procurement, both the Board of Public Works and the legislature said to the WIC program, don't do this anymore. Get this in regulation. We don't want to see any more procurements for WIC vouchers. And so the WIC program did, and it never had to be procured again. But I had the good fortune of, for this procurement, and I probably mentioned this in Perform, for this exact procurement, I had 156 protests. Whoa. 600, more than 600 stores submitted proposals to win 300 awards. And half of the stores that didn't win filed protests. It was fun. So in this particular one, the basis of the ambiguity was that in the specifications, offerers had to certify the prices listed on the price form were the actual shelf prices as of the date of submission. So when you, the vendor, put your prices down, sign your bid form, put it in the envelope, you are certifying according to the words on the bid form itself that those were the prices that you had on your store shelves as of the date you put this in the envelope. However, other places in the specification said the prices on the price form had to be verified as the actual shelf prices by WIC inspectors as of the date of a site visit to verify all circumstances of the offer. Because what we said was the offers come in, and then the WIC program will send out to every store that applied. They will send out inspectors who will go through and make sure that the stores were open, that they had sufficient quantity of stock, that they were open given hours of operation, that they were accessible to the handicapped, that they carried at least this quantity of this food and list at least this quantity of another food. So they did like an hour inspection of the store to verify all the circumstances on the bid form. So we had a page or more in the specifications of the fact of what had to be verified during the on-site inspection, including these were the shelf prices that were included on the price form. And what happened was, in this particular situation, there was stores in Harford County, and they selected, if I remember, a Mars store over a Klein's store. And Klein's protested, one of the 156. And the protest, and reality is, this is the only one of the 156 protests that I thought had merit. And I actually agonized over this because before the vendor in their protest pointed out that one in green that we were certifying as of the date of submission, I had overlooked that it even said that. I had not even noticed, neither I nor anybody else had noticed that we had 2 different requirements in the same solicitation. So it's like, all right, this vendor is correct. It does say on the bid form, one place in small print at the bottom, you are certifying as of the date of submission. It says, like several pages in a page and a half of requirements, you certify as of the date of site visit. And there was no question as of the date of site visit, those shelf prices were verified as being the shelf prices that existed, the same as were on the price form that was submitted. So I'm looking, I got a 55-45 proposition here. The vendor's right, and I can only go with one or the other. So I went with the site visit as being the requirement, not the date of submission. So I denied the protest. And of course, the vendor accepted that and went away and was very pleased to go away. Actually, what they did was they filed an appeal to the Board of Contract Appeals. The other thing happened, the other thing they said, okay, aside from that, and the thing that was an important consideration was on the date that this store sent in their price form, they had not yet opened. They were new. They opened about 3 days later. So, and that was what was in the protest. Not only are you certifying that this is your shelf price as of the date of submission, but you weren't open on the date you submitted your price form, so how can you certify these were the prices for a store that wasn't open? So that was another complicating factor. And again, I went with the date of the site inspection because they were open for like 10 days before the site inspection occurred. So I denied the protest. The ambiguity between the two different price certification times could have been detected in advance. But believe me, I didn't see it, WIC didn't see it, apparently no other vendor saw that it had that conflict. It would have taken great perceptiveness to have noticed it, so I interpreted that this was a latent ambiguity. And it was decided that the as of WIC inspection was stronger than the other wording. And the as of submission date statement was one line in the price form and the other had much more. So I denied the protest, it was appealed. The Board of Contract Appeals, in their case number 1773, upheld me. They agreed with my decision. However, they didn't agree on my decision on the same grounds that I had denied the protest. They came up with a different reason to uphold my decision. So instead of dealing with ambiguity, whether it was a patent ambiguity or latent ambiguity, what they said was the vendor was belatedly protesting the specifications. And you have to protest specifications before the due date. So they said it was late. So they rejected it. And the vendor went away happy, meaning they appealed the Board of Contract Appeals decision to Harford County Circuit Court. Those of you who might know the Kleins brothers in Harford County, they're homegrown Harford County residents. They own 4 or 5 stores in Harford County. They are the native sons of Harford County. Mars is not from Harford County. So it went to Harford County. And the Harford County Circuit Court overturned the Board of Contract Appeals decision, which the courts have the right to do. Just as the Board of Contract Appeals cannot uphold the agency decision, Circuit Court does not have to uphold the Board of Contract Appeals decision. And so what the Harford County Circuit Court ruled was that this was a latent ambiguity, and because it was a latent ambiguity, the protester could not have protested the specs because they could not have identified there was a problem. And so, number one, they said because it was not an issue of the specification, it was an issue of latent ambiguity, they said the Board of Contract Appeals was not right in rejecting it on the grounds of the specifications. And then they went further and said because it was a latent ambiguity, the interpretation of the vendor is what prevails. Even though we said clearly, we meant for it to be as of the date of the site visit, Harford County Court said, no, we didn't. And so they said, Kleins, you win, Mars, you lose. And we didn't appeal, Mars didn't appeal. So it was left at, we didn't get the store that we thought was the better store in that situation because of what was interpreted as a latent ambiguity. The ambiguity of 2 conflicting time frames was latent. The judge agreed the interpretation of the protester, the store was not open, could not certify its shelf prices as of the submission date, thus was ineligible for award. The interpretation of the appellant trumped the interpretation of DHMA. Unambiguous. 2000. Baltimore-Washington International Airport. They did a procurement for taxi services. And the specification said, as underlined, all trips have to be dispatched, which means literally someone, if you go familiar with the airport, you walk out of the airport and there's a line of cabs sitting there. And everyone knows you just go to the first cab in line, you get in, they take off, and then they all pull forward, and the next one becomes the first, and you take off when someone's in it, etc. There is no dispatching of getting a cab at BWI Airport. But there was a vendor who bid and who set up a scenario to have every person who wanted to take the cab being dispatched to that cab. And because they set up this scenario to comply with the specifications, they were much higher than any other vendor. And the Maryland Aviation Administration that runs BWI Airport didn't select them. They said they were too high priced, and when they protested, they said because they were the only vendor that really complied with the specifications, what MAA said was, well, you really didn't seriously believe that you should do that, did you? It was unreasonable for you to expect that you would have to dispatch calls for people to get in the taxi cabs. So they denied the protest. Non-selected vendor protested, and then what the Aviation Administration did was, instead of letting the vendor go to the Board of Contract Appeals, they went to the Board of Public Works and asked the Board of Public Works to approve the award of the contract, notwithstanding the protest by this other vendor. And whenever that happens, the vendor inevitably comes down to the Board of Public Works and pleads their case at the Board of Public Works because they don't have the opportunity to plead it at the Board of Contract Appeals. And once they pointed out that the specifications said all, and Governor Glendening was the governor at that time, and he said, and when the person said that, he said, can you show me that? And the lawyer for the protester went up, showed him the specifications with the word all, and Governor Glendening said to the people from Aviation Administration, is that your specifications? And they said, yeah. Did this vendor meet the specifications? And they said, yeah. Did any other vendor meet the specifications? Well, no, you see, it wasn't reasonable. No. Did any other vendor meet those specifications? Well, no. End of story. We're not going to make this award. You're going to rebid this. This is stupid. You don't penalize a vendor for doing what your specifications say. So, bottom line is, say what you mean what you say. So there was nothing, and they asked the vendor why.
They went out again and rebid.
They went out and, yeah. He said, now, how soon before you have this back here again? And I think they said 2 months or something like that. And he said, make it 6 weeks or something like that. But they had to go out again, and of course the next time they didn't have that requirement for dispatching because everyone agreed it was ridiculous to have that requirement. And what Aviation Administration, one of the things they said was nobody questioned that requirement. And what the protest said in particular is, I didn't need to question it. There's no ambiguity about all calls must be dispatched. What am I going to question about it? And the other people didn't say anything because they just assumed it wasn't meant. So that's what happened in that situation. Ambiguity. The robbery exercise. What time is it? Well, we're not going to do it at 10 till 4. We have this wonderful exercise for you when you come back next on 10 days. 18. So let's just go on a little bit, and you know that you have this wonderful exercise of the robbery. And we're not going to do, that exercise was the one, if you took the procure class, procure class, we talked about the vending machine contract for public safety. Well, we have that, we're going to give it out to you, but we're not going to actually use it in exercise because we take too much time in exercises. All right, does this look familiar? Does that show up on your printout?
Yes.
All right, what does it say? As marketing requested it, as sales ordered it, as engineering designed it, as data processing programmed it, as services installed it, what the customer wanted. This is just another way to illustrate peanut butter and jelly. Just a little humor. Every now and then we try and get some humor in here. Common problematic language as mutually agreed upon. Have any of you ever wrote as mutually agreed upon? Makes the state and contractor equals, which means it basically gives the contractor veto power over the wishes of the state. To avoid requirements it doesn't like, all the contractor theoretically has to do is not agree to whatever the state proposes, and since there is not agreement, then you don't have to do it because there's no agreement. This phrase should seldom, if ever, be used. It is the state's contract. The state is paying for performance. We should be able to say what it is we want you to do. So if I see as mutually agreed upon, I will allow that in certain very narrow circumstances. But as a general rule, don't say it. Should not be used for any activity or issue that is critical to the state. If it is used, include a statement that if mutual agreement cannot be reached within a given time frame, 1 week, 10 days, something like that the position of the state will prevail. So that should incentivize the vendor to want to come to an agreement, because if they don't, our position will prevail. As determined by the state. Obviously, that's much better than mutually agreed upon. As determined by the state. It avoids the possible stalemate described in the 2 prior slides by firmly saying the state is in charge. If used sparingly in the right circumstances, it may be fine. Example in the prior slide regarding the lack of mutual agreement. But even then, it probably should be worded as reasonably determined by the state, the word reasonable. It should not be used extensively, especially if it is applied to major requirements or deliverables. It is easy to use this as a crutch instead of actually determining what the state wants. We can't figure out what we want, so we'll just say, as determined. And we'll kind of figure it out later. But what that means is that the vendor doesn't know what we want, because we don't even know what we want. And so the vendor can't really price it out, can't really respond to it. It's an unknown. Let's see. When used extensively, this phrase can create ambiguity. Vendors need to know the requirements of a contract to know if they can perform it, to identify the needed level of effort, to determine the time frame, and as highlighted, determine the appropriate price to charge to perform the requirements. They can't price, they can't propose to something they don't know what it is. If the contractor isn't told what the state's determinations are until after the contract is awarded, the contractor may find itself expected to perform something far different and far more costly than it anticipated, which may cause the contractor to file a contract claim on the basis of latent ambiguity. It could assert that it had no idea the state was going to determine what it did, and it couldn't have asked for clarification before the due date because the state didn't know itself, so it couldn't clarify. There is a very good chance that the vendor would win a claim of latent ambiguity for a belated state requirement determination that greatly exceeded what was expected, as long as what was expected was reasonable. As previously stated, if it is upheld that there was latent ambiguity in the specifications, the vendor's reasonable interpretation will prevail, so it is generally best to determine what the state wants up front to avoid possible problems later. And if we can't determine it, make it an evaluated procurement to have the vendor tell us. As needed. We've all used as needed. This is basically the same as the previous as determined by the state situation, so all the discussion in the 4 previous slides apply for this wording. However, this wording might be all right if some maximum parameters were included. The contractor must meet as often as needed, not to exceed once weekly. As soon as you put a parameter, it is not open-ended. It has bookends to it. They know what they don't have to exceed. By setting the maximum limit of 1 meeting per week, the contractor knows that his maximum cost exposure, knows what it is, so the contractor can have included the maximum possibility in his price. This should eliminate any problem with compliance claims, etc. However, now it might cost the state more money than necessary, because a vendor is logically going to include in his price the maximum stated number of meetings, which means the state's going to pay for weekly meetings, even if it never holds weekly meetings. Or this is another alternative. to how you can structure this. The contractor could be permitted to bill for any meetings in excess of a maximum. So we can say, you must agree to meet once monthly. We reserve the ability to require more meetings. However, in the price form, we can allow them to quote a price for each meeting above one per month. That way, if we call for another meeting, we know we're going to pay for it, and we know how much we're going to pay for it, and all the risk is taken off the vendor. There is no risk to either party. If we call for it, we know what the price is. If we don't call for it, we don't pay the price. If we call for it, the vendor knows what they're going to get paid. So if this were done, the maximum number of meetings the vendor would have to include in his price could be reduced probably, so that the state is only paying for the meetings that actually happen. If this were done, the price form would need to have a price quoted for meetings and a model of estimated quantities to allow this price to be included in the overall quoted price. Remember, anytime you declare that the state will do something, the vendor can legally hold you to do it. In particular, vendors will frequently cite the state's non-performance of the state's stated contract obligations as justification for vendor non-performance. All requirements should be reasonable given the particular industry. Be prepared to pay extra if you state a requirement that mandate unreasonable time or quality performance. Be cautious about adding standard language from a vendor's contract. Be very cautious, because usually something in a vendor's contract is going to be contrary to the interests of the state. So a general rule is you don't do it. If you do it, make sure you read that contract first. Make sure there is nothing objectionable. In particular, you cannot ever agree that the laws of another state will be the ones that apply to a contract. So only the Board of Public Works can agree to a provision that allows the laws of another state to prevail in the governance of a contract. So a vendor's contract, frequently these contain clauses that conflict with state procurement regulations or the other specifications of the contract, or they're not otherwise in the state's best interest. And I'm going to do this example, and then we will be done. 1998, Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services and Hitachi. Public Services did a sealed bid procurement to obtain a redundant array of inexpensive disk direct access storage disks. It's a RAD DASD. Hitachi was the lowest bidder, and I don't know what that is, but that's what it was. Some of you may know that. Although, now the kicker here was Public Safety submitted an item to the Board of Public Works for approval before they ever had Hitachi sign a contract, which, as you know, is a no-no. And one of the reasons it's a no-no is because of this occurrence. So although Hitachi had not yet signed Public Safety's contract, Public Safety submitted the award for the board approval. The lack of a signed contract was not known when this contract was approved by the Board of Public Works on March 18, 1998. After Board of Public Works approval, Public Safety went to Hitachi and said, okay, sign the contract. And for the first time, at that time, once they were asked to sign the contract, Hitachi objected to some of the clauses in the state's contract and also said, oh, and Public Safety, aside from us wanting these clauses removed from your contract, you have to sign our contract. Public Safety said no to both of those. Can't take out mandatory clauses, not going to sign your contract. So actually, and this was a sealed bid, so if you think about this, if this would have been known as it should have been known before the bids were submitted, before there was any attempt at an award, the bid would have been non-responsive. You can't take exception to substantive mandatory clauses. You can't require us to sign your contract. Non-responsive, but it wasn't judged non-responsive because they didn't do, Public Safety didn't do their homework before they submitted this for an award. Should have been discovered before, despite the fact that negotiations, now this is another kicker, despite the fact that negotiations are not permitted in, actually that should be CSB. So I will correct that the next time. In a sealed bid procurement, Public Safety went back to Hitachi and tried to get them to remove their exception. You can't do that. So that was now the second or third wrong that happened in this situation. But Hitachi, even though they should have just accepted, they refused. They wouldn't signed the contract, etc. And now there's another kicker. A performance bond was required for this procurement. But the performance bond wasn't due until 5 days after a notice to proceed. And, well, you can't issue a notice to proceed until you have a signed contract. And there's no signed contract, so you can't give the notice to proceed. So you can't get the performance bond, so you can't go against the performance bond. And they didn't require a bid bond. A bid bond is the thing that's supposed to ensure that a vendor will sign the state's contract. It fills in the gap between when a bid is submitted and when the performance bond takes over. So by not signing the contract, since there was no bid bond to be forfeited, they were protecting, Hitachi was protecting us, or public safety, going against the performance bond. And that's discussed in the bonding class. So public safety, after all of this, declared Hitachi to be in default of the contract they hadn't signed. And went to award to the next bidder, next lowest bidder, and there was a $91,516 difference between Hitachi's bid and the bid of the next lowest bidder, which I think was IBM, but that's not important. And this is the only specific instance I'm aware of where the vendor paid up. Hitachi, because this was obviously a clear-cut example of them not complying with the terms of the requirement, they paid the $91,516. But obviously this was a compounding of errors that never should have gotten to this point, and it just proves of why we don't do things until contracts are in place. We make sure everything is done before we go forward.
I think they paid the 91 to stay on the bidders list.
Could have. So when we come back, we will start with simple roles.